Aaron. All right, so thanks. So here we go with Pete.
Thank you, Troy, and Julie, and everybody on the staff said this is a wonderful opportunity, and I love giving this presentation. So please keep me in mind if you had other audiences you thought were important. And I would just say on the upfront, this climate model is the product of MIT's Sloan School of Management. And if you're really excited about what the model can do and want to explore more, they do offer free trainings. They're always looking for new ambassadors. And it's wonderful. And it's a great way of kind of putting into perspective a lot of what's going on. It can be sobering, and there's limitations like there are with any model, but I think it's a really powerful tool for kind of getting a suss of the global perspective. So without, I kind of want this to be, as I was saying before everyone jumped on, I want this to be as participatory as possible, so led by your questions. So I'm going to give you a quick tour of what the model looks like. I'm sure there's going to be questions on long-term stuff, but also, about the news we should all be celebrating about federal government passing the Inflation Reduction Act. Thank you, everybody who called our members of Congress. This is a lot to celebrate. We certainly have a lot more work to do, but hopefully this is the beginning of the momentum for doing national policy. So, and with international repercussions, of course. So, with that said, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so that I don't take up more time, because the real star of the show should probably be the model and not me. And if Troy, you do want to steal my thunder, I'm happy to let you do that. But here it is. If I click, can everyone see that? Just someone give me a thumbs up so I can tell. Okay, great. So what we're looking at here is the En-ROADS model, as I said, is about, it's put out by MIT Sloan School of Management. It's about 2.5 years old. Previous to this, they had a different iteration, which is still available, called C-ROADS, which actually is less policy specific. It's just about what different regions of the world had to keep their carbon emissions limited to in order to avert catastrophe or to try to make the goals made explicit by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That policy was actually kind of pivotal. One of the volunteers I work with, Susanna Hancock, is a Mainer, and she is a longtime contributor to the IPCC reports, and her hometown's Freeport. And she was saying that the C-ROAD stuff was actually kind of a pivotal tool for the 2015 Paris Protocol negotiations. This tool is kind of the next level, which is talking about policy and how we can get to those targets through policy efforts on a global scale. So the one shortcoming I want you to all keep in mind is the fact that we're talking about the globe. So what may be good for Maine or for Portland, South Portland, our region, it may not have the same impacts when extrapolated all over the planet. So keep that caveat in mind as we go through this. But what we're looking at here is greenhouse gas emissions from the past 22 years of history and the next 78 years of the future, going to the end of the century. On this side, and you can see the slight dip of where COVID hit us right here, the past couple of years. And then on the left is where the world's energy is coming from. So black is coal, red is oil, blue natural gas, green is renewables, which thankfully is growing towards the end of the century. And then there's bioenergy and a trace of nuclear. And what these sliders do all over this model, there's two ways to manipulate the model. You can move these sliders left or right, which is kind of a macro level gross adjustment, which is basically changing the profile on these H sliders of where the supply of our energy is coming from, or where the demand is. So, transportation, making it more energy efficient, or encouraging electrification, or same thing with building an industry. Population and economic growth, that's kind of tough to play with because who knows what that's going to do in the future, and but we can adjust if we wanted to. Land use, so either deforestation, the rate at which we're cutting down the world's forests, their natural carbon sequestration of the forests, and also methane and natural gases, and other gases rather, that come from either land use practices or leaks in natural gas pipelines and industrial problems. And then carbon removal, which is, as we move into the future, looks more and more likely that we're going to have to really seriously engage with in order to meet our goals or to make the future safe, which is planting trees naturally, and then technologically. And there's a number of different categories. And each one, you can see these 3 buttons here. I'll put in the chat at some point the whole thing link so you can play with this if this is your first time seeing it. But these 3 dots actually drive, you can be more specific about any of these policies, but I'll just dig into technological carbon removal as an example, where I could do the gross difference, but I could also remove carbon. They break it down into 5 different categories: bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, which think of kelp farms or algae blooms that are intentionally, like running tide is actually an industry doing something like that here in the Portland area. Direct air capture is like big HVAC equipment, basically sponging the atmosphere, which is very cost prohibitive right now, but who knows what the future may hold. Enhanced mineralization is, agricultural soil sequestration and biochar all kind of fall into the category of like land practices of different varieties. And each one of these, so there's a lot of things this model does. The training session is free if you want to climb Nerd Mountain and become an ambassador, but you can see all the different things we can look at: cost of electricity, sea level rise. We can actually be specific and actually look on a map of what projected sea level rise is projected to be with business as usual, but also in specific locales with different perspectives on or different policy put into place. So anyways, temperature is obviously the big key. Greenhouse gas emission by gas is one I like to use, where this charcoal gray is where CO2 from industrial sources, and then methane is our number 2 greenhouse gas coefficient. But anyways, let's go back to where we started, and I'll revert to that. But I'd like to open this up to just kind of say, I know a lot of folks are probably thinking about what's happened in Congress or have other ideas of popular or cited climate policies that they'd like to see modeled on this global scale. So go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up if you want to see something. Or if you're all bashful, I could kind of tell you about the greatest hits that I usually hear when people do these things.
I got one, Pete, if other
Okay,
people
great.
don't have one.
Oh.
So one of the things in the Inflation Reduction Act was a price on methane for fugitive methane. And do you have anything to do about that?
Yeah, thank you, Troy. That's fantastic. And that's much wonkier than the usual first one I get, but I appreciate it. So here we go. The price on methane is something to very much celebrate. This was one of the many things, along with EV tax credits and other things, that we thought was on the chopping block in order to, Joe Manchin has explicitly line itemed out. And somehow they're back in there. So I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. But anyways, if we had gone to methane reduction here, again, I could go through here and be specific about it, but let's just grab this kind of on an overall level and just kind of move this. If we're actually pricing methane and moving this down, we can see where this is going. I might actually show you this. This is greenhouse gas overall. If I break this down to which kind of greenhouse gas, this is business as usual, and you can see the blue there is methane. Well, and it's gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. So methane is much smaller trace of it we're emitting than the trillion pounds of carbon we're emitting into the atmosphere every month in the United States, but it's much more powerful. So when I slide this down, you can see that wedge gets smaller, which is excellent news, and it does bring down our expected temperature increases. But we still have to deal with this large carbon, especially coming from energy source carbon emissions that are coming. I could actually just kind of go through if you want. We can talk a lot about.
Peter?
Yes, go ahead, Gail.
Gail from Senator King's office.
Hi.
Hi. Good morning. Thanks so much for doing this. I think I'm going to recommend to our DC office to watch this recording and see if they're interested in getting trained. When I turned on the news this morning, maybe we all heard it, but I guess Arctic icebergs are melting at more than twice the rate. I guess twice the rate is kind of the going number. how does this model help me understand that? If it does,
Yeah.
and I guess what I'm trying to get my mind around, is this model going to help us understand how to stem that rate of reduction in ice forms? So if you could just, again, at a pretty basic level, help me understand how this model might help me answer that question, or verify at what rate current science is saying they are actually reducing, because I thought it was twice the rate, and this morning I learned it's not. So anything you can.
Yeah, I haven't seen that news yet.
About.
Yeah, thank you, Gail, and thank you so much for being here and for all the work you're doing with Senator King's office. He's a real champion on this. I did show this to Caroline Cullen, and I did show it to John Bryan, and I'd love to show it to the senator himself, but at some point. But let me show you you're speaking. What's nice about this model is that when I do presentations and people push back about this, or when there's reasons to kind of suspect that the baseline may be different, like business as usual baseline may be different from what we're believing. So for instance, I can actually adjust those assumptions. So what you're talking about, and I haven't seen the news this morning about that yet, is climate sensitivity, probably, I believe, is this category. So you can see all the different things we're looking at here. And if I actually went to sea level, this is again wonky, temperature threshold, permafrost, methane's, carbon cycles. Yes, I'm not. It's one of these. I'm sorry. This is much deeper dive than I normally do. I'm sorry, but
it's right there at the top, Pete.
Is it?
Second one down.
Second one. Yep.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay. So yes. So we could worry about this contribution of sea level rise from the Arctic ice melt sheet. So we can kind of move in these directions and say that this is all defaulting to the latest thinking as reported by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it all is peer-reviewed information going into this model. And then it's a giant systems dynamics thing like related to this. But basically we can say like, okay, well, maybe this is going to be more sensitive. This doesn't actually change what we're talking about for temperature. But if I went to this and talked about sea level rise, we can see that the current scenario projects a lot greater sea level rise. I could actually go, this is quite wonky, but I will go in this direction. If I went to, we could actually go, there's an opportunity here. Let's see. If I go to sea level rise, I can actually go to flood maps. This is a new feature of this since the last time we talked, Troy and Julie, about this.
Wow.
And of course, my internet is slow, but I can actually go to Miami or whatever, or Alexandria. I guess we're in Alexandria, Egypt. Why not? Yeah. And see what this looks like. So the policy right now, it shows how much of the metropolitan area of Alexandria, Egypt is going to be flooded by the end of the century. And if I were to do some climate mitigation work or carbon mitigation work or greenhouse gas mitigation, you can see that I could actually, green would come into the area of the land that I had saved from this. And this is just going off this. So I can put, I can put Portland, Maine in here and see what this looks like. So Scarborough takes a hit. Portland, we benefit, this is, once we benefit from having a pretty steep incline on our city, but you can see what this looks like here. So yeah, does that, and about as far as mitigation, Gail, I will talk actually while you're here, maybe it'll be helpful to just kind of go through the bullet points of the Inflation Reduction Act and just talk about all the things we have to celebrate instead of hanging out on the bleak look of what sea level rise looks like in Alexandria, if that's okay. So I might return this to its default setting. And let me move this back to this greenhouse gas emissions by gas. So I'm now returning this. So let's talk a little bit about all these things in there. And if I'm forgetting any of the provisions, because you guys are the real climate champions here, about the provisions that are in the Inflation Reduction Act and talk about what they look like. So for instance, there's quite a bit, one of the greatest things to celebrate is the continuation of renewable incentives. So this model shows the importance of of these things, but it's also an economics-based thing. So it's like if I slide this lever over here, it's not magically creating renewables, it's incentivizing them through economics, through tax structures or rebates or that sort of thing. So that's wonderful to see. So I'm sliding this over and I can see, let's highly subsidize that. So I can see that green wedge is now eating into some of the market share that used to belong to coal, the dirtiest and most plentiful natural fossil fuel, natural gas and oil. And you can see how that ate over here. We also talked a little bit about the methane price that Troy mentioned. There is a significant amount of money in energy efficiency for transportation and for electrification. Those tax credits are continuing, which is wonderful. There's a little bit more modest in electrification for buildings, but there are money for heat pump there and for efficiency. So I'm moving this all up. Now, this is on a global scale here. So you can see where we are at. What else am I forgetting that's in the bill? I think that's, there may be some, well, at least there are some complementary policies like the Forest Act, which Senator King and Senator Collins have been working on to try to do some sequestration. So we could talk about that a little bit. So we can move the forestation knob up there or maybe a little bit more generous. So this is a lot of what we're looking at. What I do like to look at, and I know I'm jumping all around in order to feed the what's happening here. You can see net CO2 emissions. It's nice to see what's happening here, where we're bending this curve in the long run down quite a bit. It'll be important to note, and this is something I really can't emphasize. I can't emphasize enough putting the data point on for where, over here. If I do this, so net greenhouse gas emissions, we can also look at the cost of energy, which looks like it's also falling, which is great for consumers. We can see here where the UN says we need to be in order. This is, this where the IPCC and the Paris Protocol negotiation said that data point is what we want our blue line to intersect. So this is all wonderful. We do need more work, of course, in order to get to that spot. And of course, the scientific community is telling us that we need to exceed the Paris protocols to really stabilize the climate. So we've got a significant amount of work to do on this in order to get to that point. It's really about timing. It's about the fact that these things, as they roll out and as the world transitions away, we're still remaining to have a bit of a market share for oil, gas, natural gas, oil, and coal. And I'm actually kind of being generous here because I'm extrapolating this to the global level. So the baseline is changing. The fact that the United States has tripled their already record-breaking allocation of money towards renewables and on all these other measures, that was the record that was set with the infrastructure package last year is now tripled with the $369 billion set aside for climate. That's huge. Jim, William, I'm sorry.
Hi, Peter. As you cranked up the renewables there, you didn't reduce the fossil fuel, either the oil or the natural gas. Would that have been the likely effect of increasing renewables?
So here, this is without those renewable subsidies. What I'm trying to do here is show you what happened in the Inflation Reduction Act without those renewable subsidies continuing or without us adding on more aggressive renewable subsidies. You can see this is the market share of where renewables are, that green, comparative to blue is natural gas, red is oil, and black is carbon. I'm sorry, charcoal. Coal, thank you. If I move renewables all the way over and highly incentivize it, you can see that wedge is growing and it eats a bit into the other ones, but you're correct. One of the problems and why we need to do more is because no matter what we do with incentives, there's a limited impact on what is going to happen with legacy fossil fuels. Does that make sense? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you can think about it this way. If I were to, let's move away from, I'm going to actually save this scenario and move back to business as usual without anything. And if I only did, because sometimes it's easier to see what one policy by itself will look like as it impacts. So if I just looked at renewables incentives only, so I'm maximizing that on the worldwide scale, you can see I love seeing that green wedge grow. But we can also see where coal, the dirtiest and the one we're most worried about, but to a lesser extent, oil and natural gas are. And you have to think about this not as much as a climate scientist and more as an economist. So if we are making it cheaper, I can actually look at this comparatively. No, I'll save you that. But if you're making it cheaper to move towards renewables, whether that be wind, solar, hydro, tidal, et cetera, geothermal, what's happening to the price of those fossil fuels that remain, particularly coal, which is the dirtiest and causes so many deaths every year because of particulate matter? The price is going to go do what when people all move to renewables? Bill. Yes, right. It goes down. So because it's sitting around and no one's using it. So what happens, you can see, it is actually, this graph shows the economics of this perfectly, where we see coal has a dip in the middle of the century, but after the market absorbs the lessening of the incentives for renewables, coal starts picking up again as humanity needs more energy as the economy and population continues to grow. Then the problem is that we're doing wonders, of course, way more than we had ever before with these incentives for renewables, but we're not getting really close to where that red dot is, and particularly, moving this curve down enough. And I can look at the temperature as well. Enough, you can see the shave in temperature without putting downward pressure, disincentives on the legacy fossil fuels. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it's a big place, and whatever we do in the United States only affects a very small portion of the world. Well,
that is true. We're still, historically, we're the biggest CO2 greenhouse gas emitter, but this model is actually, I'm showing you this is global. This is actually happening across the board with these incentives. So this is the limits of an incentive-only approach, is that it does not get us anywhere near the targets of, these dashed lines are where the IPCC says we need to keep our temperatures below in order to avert calamity. And here we are at the end of the century. So the big point about this is that, and this is why, more economists have signed on to a statement saying we need a particular brand of downward pressure on fossil fuels and not just an incentives only approach. Don't get me wrong, we're in a much better place than we were 2 weeks ago, but we have a lot of work to do still. But this is not so much about regionality. This is just about, like, if we continue to just kind of incentivize the good stuff without putting a penalty on the bad stuff, then this is where we get.
Can I ask one other question? Is divestiture at all in play here?
That's a good question. Divestiture is tough because it's not, it's a very indirect way. This model is kind of dealing exclusively with like direct ways. We could talk about like divestiture, maybe making it less profitable to go for coal, oil, and natural gas, but it's really hard to model on this because this is just basically about like government policy and less about consumers advocacy and that kind of stuff. Mm. But it's certainly something to consider. I'm probably the closest I could get to modeling was like ticking away on all these things, just kind of like at some level that I'm making up right now, to the point to get us to like, this is the reduction that we're seeing in those folks who are concerned about the climate and are changing their investments to reflect that. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Fred.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I suppose it's probably implied in the fact that all of these models are pushing out results on a global basis, but I'm wondering, and maybe it was intentional, that geopolitics weren't kind of factored in, or maybe they were. I played around with the assumptions a little bit, and it's a super cool model, but I mean, all this assumes that the world moves as one towards these goals, right? So if there are variations regionally, does the model account for that? Or can, I know that's a tough thing to do, but
that's the biggest shortcoming that comes up on this, is because a sacrifice is to make it easy to use and to make it, I mean, it's still good, I think, in comparing regional or national or policies, because you can still see how it affects things in relationship to other policies. But it's very difficult there are other models out there that do that, like the Energy Policy Simulator, which costs quite a bit of, a bit more money to be regionally specific, and they can talk about that. And I'll put my information in the chat and I can show you links to some of that information if you like, but that stuff is, breaks down a little bit more as far as the different policies that are regionally specific policies.
Thanks.
John.
Yeah, no, it's just a quick question around obsolescence, because coal doesn't burn itself, and you sort of show this drop in price and its disfavor. You need a coal plant, and it just seems like I'm surprised it doesn't actually start to decline, because these plants get obsolescence, and the cost of actually keeping these old plants and not building new plants really starts to take effect. And it's like it's expensive to buy a carbureted car now because no one makes them.
Right.
And not that it's not workable, it's just that you actually get the decline once you start to see that shift away from the fuel in the entire production supply chain. It's not just the fuel.
Yes, John, that's a great point. But remember, so we're and this is true very much in this country where coal is losing more and more market. It's on a downward spiral. A lot of that is a result of the fracking boom that's happened. But remember, this is a global model. So even though coal is getting crushed here in this country, when Australia 2 winters ago was experiencing its record wildfires and 1 billion mammals died in those fires, their #1 export to the developing nations near them was, actually the #1 export period was coal. And we're building, parts of the developing world are still building coal-powered plants because it's the cheapest way for them to get in that direction. So that's where this model is inclusive. And so, again, another factor in where the policy has to, the model has to reflect policy on a global scale. So even though coal is, you're right, the best way to talk about coal, so let's talk about this. If we actually got into a wonky thing and talked about, let's model what happens if the international community, the UN, brokers a deal where we decide we're going to stop building new coal infrastructure and forbid it across the globe. And if we did that, there we go. So you can see what happens there. That does a significant, look at what happens. So now coal plants are no longer being created. We're just having those coal plants die off, or, as they become, as they end their life cycle, then suddenly coal is gone from the rest of the energy portfolio across the world. And it did a significant distance, we shaved off 0.3 of a degree. And renewables grew as a result. We also had a small growth in natural gas and oil to pick up that slack. So let me talk a little bit more. I just want to show you a couple of things, and maybe this will trigger some more questions. But if you're seeing this slide too, if I change what I just looked at, correct? Troy, just give me a nod. Okay, good. So this is where we are, and this is why we should be celebrating, and we should all be writing letters to the editor, or letters to Gail's office and Senator, Representative Pingree's office, and hopefully Representative Golden's office, who are likely to support this coming through the House, hopefully today, where this puts us on a trajectory of current policy without the Inflation Reduction Act, and this is where the Inflation Reduction Act gets us. According to the Rhodium Group, which did an independent analysis saying that we got a 31 to 44% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Here's our Paris targets down there. So it's, it's inching us in a good direction, and we're getting closer. And it's certainly as close as we've been in a long time, considering where we have gone over the past decades. And you can see here, this is a projection of where our new energy capacity is going to be put. And you can see black is coal on this. This is like from decades, this goes all the way back to the 1950s. And you can see as energy grows in the future, what we're projecting to see, a lot of this yellow is all solar and blue is all wind. This is all wonderful news to celebrate. But the bad news is that we will still have this is the past into the future, and there's a variation on this depending on which you're looking at. But again, this is showing that there will still be a market for crude oil and for natural gas in this country, which is something we have to correct. Now, the one thing I will say that's exciting And this gets also to that global capacity of this, is that the United States, as we speak, is the only developed nation in the world without a carbon price, which is of some form. You can see on this map all of the nations of the world that have a carbon price, and of some either regionally, like the EU, or which has a cap and trade for years back, or our favorite flavor of carbon pricing is Canadian fee and dividend, which is putting a price on the fossil fuel companies, the oil, coal, and natural gas companies up there, and returning all of those profits as an equal periodic dividend check, cash in hand for every Canadian. It was actually buried in their tax structures, but now it's actually cash in hands, which has been shown by independent analysis to be a very progressive tax policy, helps out the bottom 60 to 70% income levels, and the poorer you are, the better you do. Anyhow, this is a map of the world of all the countries that have without a carbon price are in these gray shades. So we share this distinction with Belarus and Russia and Somalia and Libya. The EU, UK, and likely Canada soon after have ratified that they will be they want to increase the price. They're having such success with their carbon pricing and decarbonizing, and they're incentivized to do even more, especially with what's going on in Ukraine to get off Russian oil, that they're trying to decarbonize as fast as possible. So they can't do that without making vulnerable their own inherent businesses. So they are talking about putting up a border carbon adjustment mechanism, which we understand is getting a lot of talk on both sides of the aisle in Congress, particularly has some support amongst, the idea is this: they want to raise their carbon fee on their own regions, but they don't want their businesses to jump to Russia or the United States or someplace that doesn't have a carbon price. So they put this penalty on imports coming from those, which does two things. It protects their businesses, but more importantly, it exports the policy. And that's wonderful. And that's one of the reasons that we're strong believers in that actually creating us to put some negative pressure within that model. And I'll go back to it in a second. And the United States actually has a lot to win in this. So this is from the Climate Leadership Council's research on this, but if you looked at the United States, if the average product in the United States has a 1 unit carbon footprint, you can see on average, the United States makes our products or goods and services are much more carbon efficient than almost any other place in the world, save the EU. We're slightly more carbon emitting than they are, but look at how we win in production compared to China, India, and Russia, our big international rivals. Well, this is showing a lot of pressure on, from business community. This is why the Business Roundtable and other groups like U.S. Chamber of Commerce have been talking about advocating for a revenue neutral carbon fee and dividend structure. And if we put something like that into that model, so if I jump back to this, and I'm sorry to talk so much, but if I put that back into the model, so if actually we're now at this is pre Inflation Reduction Act, business as usual. But if I put the carbon fee and dividend as we've illustrated with Canada, which starts off at a $15 a price on the fossil fuel provider per CO2 emitted. And let's be rosy and imagine that this is going to happen this year. And it goes up every year starting this year. This is only one policy. And we drive this up over the next 70, 80 years to the end of the policy. And it goes up. So the policy that is most co-sponsored climate policy ever in the House has 96 co-sponsors, including the majority of the Progressive Caucus, the majority of the Congressional Black Caucus, majority of the Hispanic Caucus, and it has a lot of conservative support as well. Goes up by $10 a year. So 78 years is $10 at 780 plus the initial 15, which goes up like this. And you can see that gradually increasing price on carbon. And remember, this is only one policy. This is exactly why I do so much volunteering with Citizens Climate Lobby, because yes, it does not get us to all where we need to be. But if we start adding on some of the things that were in the Inflation Reduction Act, like the methane price, look at that. Already we're within shouting distance of that magic 2-degree number. And we add to that the incentives on renewables, energy efficiency of our buildings, the electricity, electrification, the forestry, the carbon sequestration stuff that's in there, and perhaps we'll get some technological carbon stuff that might come down in the future. We're already doing quite well. But remember, the big thing, no other policy does nearly as much as this. In fact, nothing does 1/5 as much of this in this model as a economy-wide carbon price, which has also benefits poor and working class folks the most because of those dividend checks being paid for on the backs of the fossil fuel providers. And a lot of the big folks like Shell and BP, which are already diversifying towards taking the intellectual capital they have for offshore oil derricks into offshore wind, those folks are beginning to join forces and ask for a carbon price because they're having to move in that direction in Europe. So that's I leave you with that as an optimistic thing. And I think even though we did not get into this bill, according to Senator Whitehouse, Gail may know better than I do, and I'm afraid to say this, but according to Senator Whitehouse and Senator Coons, who is really championing an economy-wide carbon fee and dividend, that we had 49 of the 50 necessary senators to get this into this reconciliation package back when it was called Build Back Better. And the pressure from the outside communities is only going to grow as these carbon tariffs are going to start hitting US. But of course, the carbon tariffs are actually going to be, in a weird way, a windfall for US products or US exports, because even though we're going to have a fee attached to us, it's not going to be as high as the fee on China's, India's, and Russia's products, because our competitors are so much more carbon inefficient than we are. That was a lot, so I'm just hoping that prompts some, but that's the other hat I wear besides an En-ROADS ambassador, is talking about carbon pricing. Questions?
I have a question if other
Please.
people don't. So this is, first of all, a very, very fun tool and very interesting. And it definitely points towards, international cooperation and policy making. And I wonder if, Peter, at all, if MIT has any plan to do this on a national level, because we are cities and towns on this coffee and climate. It'd be great to know just how to align our policies on a national level to achieve, what we need to achieve on our part, in addition to this.
That's a great question, Julie. And I know that there's a tremendous amount of pressure. I can't say, I've done it just coincidentally. I had a cup of coffee with one of the modelers from MIT yesterday, who happens to be vacationing in Maine. And I said to her that I can't do one of these presentations without this question in some form coming up. Like especially when I do something like, here we are in Maine and we highly incentivize electric vehicles. We all know as Mainers that we live in a big rural state with lots, with poor electric vehicle infrastructure. If I slide this over, it does increase renewables, but it also includes coal. That's not happening in Maine. That's happening in, Brunei, or it's happening in Indonesia, or, someplace else where they're pulling or India, where they're pulling 1 billion people out of poverty. But that we don't have coal-powered power plants here. So, and they're restricting themselves, I think, to just kind of stay in their lane and to talk about what they do. There are other models out there, like the Energy Policy Simulator, and we can talk later about how to get you access to that, because that's another tool that does have more of a regional and national scope to this. But that's a great question, and I don't know of any plans for En-ROADS to move in that direction, but I know that they've been hearing it from more people than just you and me.
Can I follow on that and kind of ask the question in a slightly different way? Partly because this model, part of what you talked about was what's in the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the policies in there that are going to be impactful. One of the things I've seen that seems to be impactful from state and local levels is looking at policies that put in place that may not have been sufficiently incentivized or to lower the bar to actual take action. And I look at talking to someone in Auburn who basically used ARPA money to double the incentives for heat pumps, which got people off the dime and really magnified the impact of that. And so when you look at this from a policy perspective and what's in there, what are the ones that are impactful that may not have enough funding or could benefit from moving the bar that you could align local and state policies to magnify?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So the limit, and I appreciate this about what En-ROADS is trying to do, is trying to limit the scope of what they're doing here to talk just about government policy or public policy, which looks like economic policy on most levels, to get us to a point to get us where we are. And I feel like regional questions, the communities that are way out leadership on this, and this is where we have to thank Troy and Julie and all these other folks who are doing this on the level, and folks at Greater Portland Council of Government is also folks that we could mention in this. More and more communities are going in this direction, and they'll need this. This is I just don't maybe I'm not understanding your question quite right, but it's not really talking about a lot of where the funding would be going or how to move people in an equitable way. The equitability issues kind of are a footnote in this. Maybe, what, could you just try me that question again in a different way? And maybe, because I'm not sure if I completely understand.
What are the impactful policies that are in IRA that could be more impactful if they had more funding?
Oh, okay, that's better. I'm sorry. Okay, I got pushed off by the heat pump story and the Arbor funding. Okay, well, a lot of the funding that didn't happen, I think, it's hard to know. I mean, so I actually have a list here of all the things that are in the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's remains to be seen. I was pretty tickled pink about everything in this except for the lack of the downward pressure, the penalty. There's a lot of carrots and very little sticks in this, which and it's I think the model kind of successfully shows, from my perspective, how the Paris Protocol targets are unattainable, as the IPCC has said themselves. They're quoted as saying, a carbon price is a quote unquote necessary condition for achieving our climate goals. But the funding stuff, I'm actually pretty pleased with. To my surprise, and to many others who are watching this coming through, we were all depressed for the multiple times it looked like Manchin was putting the kibosh on this. But I don't know about Troy and Julie, but I was tickled pink to see a lot of the stuff, like the EV incentives, the extension of the renewables, the heat pumps transfer, all that stuff. And we talk about the $369 million put towards climate, which is, again, more than triple the previous record in the infrastructure bill. But what they don't talk about is the additional $250 billion in loan authority for companies and technologies that are doing R&D stuff to get us to reducing. And these are means based, so that we're trying to get this to not just be a way of lining rich people's pockets. It remains to be seen, and the model actually kind of shows that all of these things do help us move in this right direction. It's just a matter of getting us. It's hard to quantify what we want to see more money in. A lot of it has to do with the research there. I think energy efficiency is one of the quickest things, and that's one of the things that communities do, is that just reducing the profile of how much that needs to grow over the course, just look how much that shrank everything down. That is a huge thing. And maybe I'm biased because I live in the state with the #1 reliance on #2 heating oil and the oldest housing stock, but I always feel like energy efficiency is to borrow a tired term, low-hanging fruit that I always need to see more of.
Looks like Bill has a question.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
Bill.
Peter, as you move the electrification bar up, in Maine, that wouldn't necessarily recognize our high percentage for RPS, correct? Because you're basing this sort of on the global, what goes into the global power plant. So if we did boil this down to either a regional or a state level, we would get more benefit out of electrification than what you're showing.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's something you just have to carry with you as you play with this model. But, I would argue that we're in a global system, right? So we need to think globally and act locally. I mean, we're trying to bring the temperature down here. It's not like we can isolate the air of Maine from particulate matter or from greenhouse gas coming, 1 trillion pounds of CO2 that this country alone releases every month. That would block out the sun if it was particulate matter.
Yeah, but I think what it does highlight is that there are unique solutions for each area. You can't necessarily say this is going to solve everyone's problem.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And there's some places that are doing better than others, but the model, at least the designers of the model, are saying that they are taking this as these regional provisions, like what California is doing and what Reggie's doing. Those things are input into the model as part of their overall strategy, saying like, okay, this is how much of the overall net emissions coming from the United States are coming from these regions and how much of them are participating. If we could get more of the countries participating, and then the percentages would go down. So the model does reflect this. It's just part of you just can't isolate. So the other, and the other thing to think about is like, the Maine emits, we're doing great things, but we are responsible for 0.27% of U.S. carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So even if like Janet Mills could wave a wand, or Julie and Troy could wave a magic wand and make it all go away, it doesn't mean that lobsters are going to stay in the Gulf of Maine. They're going to go the same way Maine shrimp did, which is a casualty of climate change. Good question, though.
I know one thing, I think about, the action, the policies in the Inflation Reduction Act and lots of the incentives. I think, I've been looking at, sheets similar to what you just presented, Pete, and it really underscores, again, the need for the work that local governments are doing, because there's going to be incentives for, heat pumps, solar panel, et cetera, EVs, but those are, people, aren't, those heat pumps don't get installed themselves, and people still need encouragement to take the action to install the heat pump. They need access to the rebates and incentives. Really, I think in a lot of ways, it's like, okay, here are these programs, we're going to fund them, and it's in a lot of ways, it's moving the ball now to our court. In a lot of ways, I think. So I think it just really underscores the need for us to stay focused on our One Climate Future goals. And again, taking these tools that are going to be provided to us and making sure that we're thinking about how to make the best use of them.
I couldn't agree more. Like the success, it's one thing to say that this is a success on paper, but nothing has been, not a pound of carbon has been removed from the future atmosphere yet, without the proper wise implementation of this allocation of record amount of money for climate. So that's what and that's why we need people who like Troy and Julie and others who really know what they're doing and implementing stuff.
And I would certainly say everyone, people who are interested enough to come have this conversation, and people in the community who are interested in doing this work, and our state and local leaders also continuing to pull in the direction that we've been going the last few years. It's and again, not just us either. I mean, there's, as you mentioned, those the financial incentives and loan support for new technologies and for developing additional clean energy resources. I'm really excited about what some of the smart people in the clean tech field are going to come up with some of the resources that are coming out of this program.
Right. Yeah, let's just do that. Just kind of like have one final shake it. So I tried modeling a bit to like what this would look like, the Inflation Reduction Act looks like on this as best as I can. What happens if we did have like a breakthrough on nuclear fusion, like with a wasteless nuclear fusion or something like that? If we actually had some sort of new carbon technology, there's this category here. See, there's one color that's not represented on this energy portfolio chart, orange, which is like where vibranium or the flux capacitor lives, something from a sci-fi novel. And if I grab this slider and move it all the way over, you can see like, boom, it starts growing up. But again, this is an economics driven model. So as wonderful as that would be, and as much as it gets us down, the big thing, especially if we want to hit this red dot, is to put downward pressure on that. So that's the next step. So
Cool.
any other questions? I feel like I've talked more than I wanted to. I wanted more input from folks, but feel free to ask. And I'm happy to put, what I'll do is I'll get rid of the flux capacitor and I'll put the IRA, I can actually save this and put it in the chat so people can play around with it. And I will, that's all right. While I'm doing this, feel free to ask me more questions.
Peter, I just want to say this is, I know usually sometimes we like to have people talk more, but this is just a lot to take in. And I think you've done a great job giving us just a glimpse of everything that you could do with this model. It's a really fascinating model to share with people. And so I'm grateful that you could be here today. Thank you.
Julie, you're very kind. You guys are awesome. I love being in a community where this is such a priority, and you and Troy are awesome leaders. So thank you for inviting me, and I guess I would put this in the chat, or I'd put my information in the chat if anybody wants to contact me, or if they had other audiences they thought might want to hear or do a presentation or a workshop with this. There's also a role-playing game. If this isn't nerdy enough for you, you can play a role-playing game where each one of us could be like, different facets, and that's pretty fun. But I guess there's no chat, so maybe I'll just send
You
it
can
to
send it to me or to Erin, and
Okay,
we can
thanks,
forward
Casey.
it to everyone. Yep, no worries.
And if you don't object, Pete, we can add it because we'll post the recording on oneclimatefuture.org, and we can add some of the details there so people can watch the recording, and then they can click the link and play with it themselves.
Yeah, and one last thing I would say is that even though we have such a small contribution to the overall greenhouse gases all over the world, and even in this country, we are the only state with both of our senators on the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. So little old Maine, with our 0.3% of the U.S. carbon emissions, can do more than any other state to drive climate policy in a robust way. So please thank Angus King and Shelley Pingree, and if you're in the 2nd District, Jared Golden, should he vote the right way on this one, and hope to publicly thank them for the efforts they're doing and encourage them to take the next steps.
Great. Well, thanks.
Here.
So thanks again. I echo Julie for your appreciation for you joining us this morning, Pete. It's really fascinating. Who knows? Maybe we'll take you up on the opportunity to do the role-playing game. There may be folks around who would be excited to do that. But
great. I'll bring my 20-sided die.
Great. So again, it's a beautiful Maine summer day. So hopefully everyone will have a chance to get out there and enjoy the great weather. And again, we'll post the recording on oneclimatefuture.org, and look forward to meeting with everyone again, maybe next month. So thanks
you.
again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Troy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.